Okay, so I think we should probably get started. And before I introduce Professor Nadell, Pamela, our honored guest, I just want to thank the many people who were instrumental in making this evening happen. And I know we're going to have an important and timely conversation. And so I'm so grateful to all the people who came together to make this happen. First, to our partners at the Center for the Study of the United States, and in particular, Yoav Fromer, the director of the center. Also to Eilon Weitzman and Hadar Dreiman, the administrators of the Roth Center and the Center for the Study of the United States, who handled the logistics of what was a very complicated itinerary. And the itinerary was complicated because Pamela is not just presenting here, she also presented in Jerusalem at Hebrew University and at Haifa. So I also want to thank our partners in Jerusalem and in Haifa for helping to make this trip happen. And as I said, I know we're going to have a very important and timely conversation because Pamela has written a book that I think will turn out to be a must-read for navigating what is a very perplexing time in American Jewish history and perhaps Jewish history more generally. So let me tell you a bit about Pamela, and then we're going to have a conversation, which eventually you guys can join into as well. So Pamela is Professor and Patrick Clendenen Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University in Washington, D.C. She's the author of many books about American history and Jewish women's history. I'll just mention one in addition to the book that we're going to talk about tonight. And that book is America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, which was the winner of the 2019 National Jewish Book Award. And the book was also translated into Hebrew. We'll talk about her new book in a second, but before we begin the conversation, I just also wanted to mention that Pamela has been very committed to public-facing scholarship, and so in addition to publishing academic books, she has also served as the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, and she's consulted on the design of several museums and several museum exhibitions, including the new exhibition here at ANU. And as hopefully we'll have time to discuss, she also testified in Congress recently in the infamous congressional hearing, which featured the 3 university presidents. So Pamela is a public-facing scholar, and that's something that's very important to us at the Roth Center as well. So I want to just say a bit about the moment in which this conversation is taking place. Because as I said, I think her book will provide us with historically informed guidance in navigating these very perplexing times. And I think these times are perplexing and perhaps alarming for many reasons. One of them, I think in ways that at least are surprising to me, but perhaps we learn from Pamela's book, they shouldn't be so surprising. One of the more surprising developments of the second Trump administration is the rise of what I would call the new Jewish question. Suddenly we find ourselves in America, but not only in America, in a period in which anti-Semitism has emerged as one of the defining political controversies of our time. And the form that this controversy takes in the United States is that suddenly what was once the parochial concern of Jewish communal organizations has become front page news. If you open newspapers in the New York Times on almost a daily basis in the past 2 years, you find some mention of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is linked to a plethora of issues and controversies that once would have seemed unrelated. Issues like deportation policy, the autonomy of the judicial branch, the goals of university education, and international relations. Somehow all of these issues, which, again, at first glance don't necessarily seem to have anything to do with Jews and Judaism, are being filtered through the figure of the Jew with implications for actual Jews. And I think this emergence of the new Jewish question has, first of all, yielded or has in addition to the fact that it has translated into some very harrowing anti-Semitic incidents recently, it's also eroded American Jews' sense of complete and unself-conscious belonging. And so that's why I think I would call it a new Jewish question, because I think the political mood in America right now is such that whatever your partisan leanings, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, as an American Jew, suddenly you're forced to entertain weighty questions about the nature of Judaism. Is Judaism a religion or is it a nationality? What's the relationship between diaspora and the state of Israel? What's the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And so all these questions are burdensome but important questions that Jews suddenly have to wrestle with and give an account of. And, as an academic, as a scholar, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Obviously, one of our goals as scholars is to challenge conventional wisdom and provide people frameworks within which to question received assumptions. So the fact that American Jews, regardless of their position on the political spectrum, are being forced to engage with and wrestle with these very weighty questions about the nature of Judaism is not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, it's not fun all of the time, and it's not without its dangers. So for these reasons, I wanted to talk to Pamela, because as I said, she's written a book which provides us with the historical background, which I think will become crucial for making sense of these perplexing and perilous times. So on that note, I want to ask you to begin by telling us a bit about the circumstances of the book's composition, because as you relate in the introduction to the book, you actually started writing the book before October 7th. And so if you could tell us a bit about, the impetus for writing the book and why, again, since October 7th, people are talking about anti-Semitism all the time, but it might not have been immediately obvious in the years prior. So what led you to suddenly feel like the moment required a new history of American anti-Semitism?
Before I do that, I want to thank Professor Julie Cooper for not only joining me tonight, but also joining me at Hebrew University, and also for basically initiating this tour of the universities, because you wrote me a number of months ago and you said, would you come to Israel if I can figure out how to get everybody together? And it's been an extraordinary experience. I've been to Israel many, many times, but I've never been to all three universities in about a week and a half.
Whirlwind tour.
A whirlwind tour. The first thing that I want to say is that while we think historians are completely dispassionate, the reality is that we are actors living in a moment in time. And what led to this book, which I worked on for 6 years, what led to it was the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on October 27th, 2018, when 11 Jews were murdered during worship on a Shabbat morning in the Tree of Life Synagogue building. And and as you said, I work on museums. I'm actually working on the rebuild of the Tree of Life building right now. So I spend a lot of time in Pittsburgh, and I can see 6-7 years later how much that trauma has rippled across not only the Jewish community of Pittsburgh, but the people who live in Pittsburgh. Most of you here won't remember, but that after 11 funerals took place in 1 week, the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a headline, and it said in Hebrew, Yikadal v'Yikadash. And what happened in its wake was that American Jewish historians, we were also in trauma. We were stunned. How had we missed that story? And we began meeting, this is pre-Zoom, we began meeting at the Center for Jewish History in New York. I was sitting in my home outside of Washington, D.C. There was a camera in the room, and we began talking about, we completely missed the role of anti-Semitism in America. The people in that room, tiny little coterie of American Jewish historians, we had written scores of books about all sorts of other subjects. We'd written about American Judaism, we had written about Jewish communities, we'd written the history of small and large Jewish communities, we had written about economic life, but we had not written about anti-Semitism as a force in the American Jewish experience. And the last good book on the subject was published in 1994 by the fine historian Leonard Dinnerstein. But as late as 2016, when people would ask him to write sort of like an update, what do you think? He was saying, and in print, he was saying, anti-Semitism is so insignificant in American Jewish life that American Jews don't see it, feel it, or hear it. And by 2017, with the Unite the Right rally, where neo-Nazis and white nationalists marched at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville with their arms outstretched in a Nazi salute, hoisting tiki torches, yelling, "Jews will not replace us," we knew that the ground beneath us was beginning to shift, and the Tree of Life massacre was the abyss that erupted. And that's really what set me on that journey.
Okay, so I think we should talk about why. Again, let me have a moment of advertisement of the new book. One of the book's arguments, as you can glean from the title, Antisemitism and American Tradition, is that there is a tradition of anti-Semitism, right? That these are not isolated incidents, but they form part of a longer tradition, that anti-Semitism has been pervasive in American history. So eventually I want us to come back to the question of, if anti-Semitism has been so pervasive, if there really is a tradition of anti-Semitism, as you suggest, why was that tradition forgotten, such that you had to rediscover it to your own surprise after the Tree of Life massacre? But before that, let's take a step backwards and talk about the distinctive forms that anti-Semitism takes in the United States. Because I think one of the powerful arguments that you make in the book is a critique of American exceptionalism, is a critique of the idea that America is this unique golden Medina, that it's so hospitable to Jews, that in contrast to the unhappy experiences that Jews had elsewhere throughout the course of Jewish history, in the United States, Jews are safe and protected. And so you suggest otherwise, right? You suggest that, again, that anti-Semitism has been pervasive throughout American Jewish history, that it's taken multiple forms. And in the second to last sentence of the book, you even write, the more things have changed, the more they have stayed the same. And so if we take your powerful critique of American exceptionalism on board, are we left with the conclusion that America is no different from other countries, other periods, or is there still something unique and distinctive about the tradition of anti-Semitism that you recover in America? So,
historians have for a long time now, regularly, like American historians, not American Jewish historians, have debunked the idea of American exceptionalism. We're actually in a moment where the current administration is demanding a rewriting of the labels at the Smithsonian Museum to, I would say, to reinscribe American exceptionalism. But historians have long debunked the idea of American exceptionalism, and I'm not the first American Jewish historian to make the argument. I'm the first one to kind of build on an article where that was laid out. Anti-Semitism in the U.S. is unquestionably different because we don't have the level of state-sponsored anti-Semitism that is characteristic of Europe. We did not have the pogroms. There's like a small pogrom somewhere, but we didn't have, organized pogroms, wave of pogroms. We did not have the Holocaust, but that doesn't mean that in the U.S. we don't have anti-Semitism. It also, I should add, it also doesn't mean that we did not have violent anti-Semitism in the U.S., because what's really stunning is the extent of the violence that I was able to uncover. And the reason so much of that violence was hidden is that because it was local and it didn't make national news. So in the 1980s, bulldozing the wall of the brand new synagogue in a town in New Jersey, as a scholar recounted to me, that didn't make national news. But today, when you can do research in local newspapers, you can go and discover that while he may have remembered that they bulldozed the wall of the brand new synagogue, what he didn't remember was that the people who did that scrawled on one of the remaining walls into the ovens with the Jews. And these events were by and large just seen as local. I think they stayed in local memory. One of the things that's happened since publishing the book is I get emails with stories from so many people, and they're telling me, either related to something in the book or the anti-Semitism they experienced. So I need to expand my database essentially. But these events happened concurrently with the end of the structural discriminations, which were the manifestation in the U.S. of government policy.
Uh-huh. And do you think that American democracy makes a difference? I mean, the unique constitutional provisions, the fact that the United States and the State of Israel are arguably the only two countries in which Jews never went formal processes of emancipation since from the very beginning. The First Amendment, the constitutional protection of religious freedom, at least on paper, positioned Jews as equal citizens and gave them recourse. Do you think that these features of American democracy account for the distinctive forms that anti-Semitism does or does not take in America?
I think, first of all, I would say that we don't get to the First Amendment until 1789. Right. So I've got 100 and some odd years before that. That's the first thing. Second thing is that when we get to the creation of the Constitution and the creation of the First Amendment, state laws enabled restrictions on Jewish rights to hold office, for example, and also practicing, their employment, working on a Sunday, for example, long history of Sunday laws. I don't think it's so much American democracy. I think it's the reality that the real dividing line in America is the color line, and that there were not only African Americans who underwent much worse hardships than Jews did, but also the indigenous peoples of the United States. And therefore, Jews, who are really tiny minority, especially before we get to the great waves of the migration, they're just like this afterthought. And they experience discrimination, they're aware of it, and they push back against it. And they're able to do it often because they're white. They pass as white.
Okay, so having mentioned the color line, that leads to another question that I wanted to ask you, which is about what you've learned from studying the history of anti-Semitism in America about where Jews fit into the American racial order. Because, again, I think your point of departure is that we're surprised by the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States, but we shouldn't be surprised because it's been there all along. And I think you could also say we shouldn't be surprised since America is a profoundly racist country, right? So the fact that Jews experience hatred as a result of their ethnic identity shouldn't necessarily be surprising given the fundamental role that anti-Black racism plays in American history. And so even though there was, thankfully there was no Jewish analog to Jim Crow, right? The racial order, nevertheless, did position Jews within it. So I wonder, do you think anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism result from the same currents in American history, different currents? How does the recounting the history of anti-Semitism the way that you do in the book give us a new angle to think about where Jews fit into the American racial order and the racial order more generally?
Let me start with the racial order now, and then I'll go back, because I'm so glad you mentioned Jim Crow, because I've been thinking about that a lot. What we have right now is we have, on the left, Jews are seen as white. On the right, they are seen as not white. And as Eric Ward wrote in his very powerful essay, Skin in the Game, he said that white nationalists are convinced that Jews have played, this is a quote from his work, have played the greatest trick the devil has ever played by making the world think they're white. So we've got this confusion, in terms of the current moment. When we think about Jim Crow and the way in which it restricted the lives of African Americans and a legal system doing that, what we also have, in a sense, in almost the same time period, more like into the 20s, but it starts in the 1890s, we also have all of these restrictions on Jewish life and Jewish behavior. So, for example, Why was a Jewish fraternity founded in 1898? It was founded in 1898 because Jews who managed to get into colleges and universities were restricted from joining the men's organizations that we know as fraternities. And so there's this form of social exclusion, but it's entrenched in many places also legally. So when we move forward into the 20th century, one of the legal restrictions becomes restrictive covenants. And those restrictive covenants they're buried in land deeds. And if you buy a house someplace, it says that you cannot sell. You cannot sell it to a black person. It also said you could not sell to an Armenian and to a Persian. And it also said either you could not sell to a Hebrew or a Jew or a Semite. And that's a legal restriction. And the U.S. government doesn't decide, it's the Supreme Court actually, doesn't decide until well after World War II that while those covenants are buried in the deeds, they're no longer enforceable. So we have the Jewish community in the United States faced the same kind of legal restrictions, but they managed, because they could present as white, they managed to, for example, find ways to work around it.
And again, if one of the contributions of your book is precisely to document the surprising to us now pervasiveness of these legal restrictions, can we take a step back and think, why were these restrictions forgotten? Why was this history repressed? Is it because of, as you say, the fact that at a certain point in Jewish history, Jews did pass as white, and so the history of repression was forgotten at a given historical moment in which Jews were no longer subject to these restrictions? How do you explain the forgetting or the repression of this history that includes not just social discrimination, but as you're pointing out now, forms of legal discrimination as well?
It's forgotten because people don't know history. I mean, let's be really honest, right? They have, if you survey Americans and they give you a list of like who was the president during the Civil War, people will often choose either Woodrow Wilson or FDR. I mean, they just don't know history. So why would we think that, and I assume you're thinking of Jewish Americans,
in particular.
Right. Why would we think that they would remember American Jewish history? I mean, I wish they would, and I wish they would read my other books, but it's like an expectation that doesn't make a lot of sense. But what jumps out is that people who experienced it never forgot it. And that was actually what happened when what led me after the Tree of Life massacre to begin asking American Jews. I happen to have written an earlier book called America's Jewish Women. Julie mentioned it's translated into Hebrew. And I was on book tour, and I decided I would ask my audiences, had they ever experienced anti-Semitism? And the stories that poured out were astonishing. And sometimes they had happened half a century before. And it's not that people forgot about it, but that it didn't interrupt their daily lives. But if somebody raised the question, and I got pretty obnoxious while I was writing this book, I spent every encounter I had, I would ask people, did you ever experience anti-Semitism? And I just collected so many stories, I should write a different book because I'm just filled with them.
So I want to come back to the discussion of American democracy and the tools, legal, political, cultural, that it does or does not offer Jews to combat anti-Semitism. Because, again, in the book, you relate a series of harrowing incidents going back to the colonial period, and you show how at almost every period in American history, anti-Semitism was present in one form or another. But one of the things I found interesting about the book is that you also detailed the legal and political strategies that Jews developed individually and as a community to fight discrimination. And many of these strategies were successful because, again, the book, almost every time that you relate a harrowing incident, the subsequent, the sort of follow-up to that incident is the ways in which the Jewish community mobilizes to gain support from the highest levels of government, official condemnations from presidents, successfully winning legal battles, mobilizing public opinion, repealing discriminatory measures. So when I read the book, at least, I felt like the most notable aspect of the American experience was not the persistence of anti-Semitic attitudes per se, but rather the effectiveness of the Jewish community's political response. So I want to ask you, first of all, do you agree with my interpretation, which is perhaps you might think it's too naive or too optimistic, but again, reading the book, even though, again, Pamela details very harrowing incidents, some familiar, such as the lynching of Leo Frank, others less so. When the experience of reading the book to me was not as shocking and depressing and destabilizing as I expected, precisely because, again, in almost every incident, even in the most egregious incidents like the lynching of Leo Frank, I saw the Jewish community mobilizing, gaining support from non-Jews, both local and at the federal level, and essentially working to create a political consensus in which anti-Semitism was verboten.
Right. So interesting, because some reviewers have said exactly the same thing, and people have told me that the book is not completely depressing because there are these many examples of where American Jews were successful. But the issue is, I think it's like, is the cup half empty or is it half full? So sometimes they're successful, and then other times they're not. And the example, and I know you're so interested in politics, the example that really jumps out at me, that I really think about, is the immigration laws that were established in 1921, the Emergency Quota Act restricting immigration to the United States, and then the National Origins Act, also called the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which set a quota on the number of, not on Jews, but on the number of people who could come from each country, and it pegged it to the census of 1890. And what jumps out at me about that is, having gone into the congressional record and seen how the debates in 1920 that led to the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, how those debates were based on consular reports coming out of Poland, talking about that millions of Jews are going to flood into America, and they're all poor Jews, and they're all refugees of the most recent wave of pogroms in Ukraine. And then we get this restrictive immigration law, and Jews try to mobilize against it. Louis Marshall testifies to Congress. We have Emmanuel Seller, who's just beginning a half-century congressional career, and he's protesting, but it's not successful. And that has huge ramifications, because then that quota is used to limit German Jewish immigration without ever filling the quota in the 1930s. So there are examples of mobilization, and Jews keep pushing back, but maybe I tended to focus, at least personally, more on the places where it didn't succeed.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a sense of why that was? I mean, is that just your constitution and your sort of personality is a more pessimistic personality, or do you think it actually focusing on the darker side of these stories tells us something important about the American Jewish experience that we wouldn't otherwise appreciate if we interpret it through my more optimistic lens, in which what's important is not the persistence of anti-Semitic attitudes, which translate into sporadic discriminatory measures and violent incidents here and there, but rather the success that Americans had for political, cultural, and religious reasons, translating their numbers into concrete political power and becoming an influential political constituency.
Right. I'm not sure if it's constitutional or not. I was on sabbatical in academic year 23 to 24. I was literally sitting in my study when everything's erupting after October 7th, and that may personally have shaded some of what I ended up writing, that maybe I would have. I mean, there are the optimistic stories there, and you're right, American Jews do flex their muscles, and they create organizations, many of which still exist today, that are going to push back against anti-Semitism and also to help Jews overseas. I'm aware of that, and a lot of that made its way into the book. But I'm wondering if maybe now, sitting here, I chose to talk about that rather than to talk about the founding of the Anti-Defamation League in 1913, which did not prevent Leo Frank's lynching.
Right, right. But do you think that again, you started the book way before October 7th, but do you think that and you don't get to choose the moment in which,
Right.
the historical moment in which your book enters into the world and the different meanings that readers will attach to the book, but do you think that you yourself reached different conclusions about the American tradition because you were finishing the book in the wake of October 7th? Do you feel like the historical moment in which the book entered the world will change the way that people receive the book and interpret the story that you're telling?
I certainly think, I mean, that's, I think, really what has happened. I worked on the book for 6 years. I sent it out into the world in October, and it gets a lot of attention because of the moment we're living in. When I was working on it, I kept saying to my husband, who's sitting back there, I kept saying, if the problem is solved by the time the book comes out, I will be thrilled because my people will be in a much better place. My publisher won't be so happy, but they can, it's okay for them. And I think that I never imagined that I would be sending it out into a moment like the current administration, where anti-Semitism has become weaponized, where it is being used essentially to destroy major elements of American liberal society, starting, of course, with the attack in higher education. And that, but you also have to remember that, with the exception of one paragraph, I finished this book in November of 2024, right? Because it takes a long time for them to put books into production, as some of the people in this room will know, including you.
Yes. So I want to come back to the weaponization of anti-Semitism by the Trump administration and the attacks on universities. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the book's closing chapter, in which you talk about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which I think, is a very important issue for those of us in the room here. As we all know, this is, one of the most controversial questions in the Jewish world today, and not just in the Jewish world, in the world at large. What is the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Is anti-Zionism always invariably anti-Semitic, or are there distinctions between the two? And reasonable people of goodwill can take very different positions on these questions about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And as I read it in the last chapter of the book, in which you talk about this fraught question and the campus protests after October 7th, you tend to think that most forms of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic. And for example, you include in your history of American anti-Semitism the BDS movement and a poster from Columbia's End Israeli Apartheid Week, which features the image of a key to symbolize the Palestinian right of return. So I'd like you to explain to us how you think about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and why you include in your history of American anti-Semitism examples like the BDS movement and the poster from Columbia's End Israeli Apartheid Week with a picture of a key symbolizing the right to return.
That chapter was the hardest chapter to write. It's the 21st century chapter. It's the last chapter of the book. I know a lot of people read it first. At one point, I actually thought of starting the book there and then going backward, but that doesn't really work for a historian too well. And I was writing that chapter obviously after October 7th.
Yeah.
And what I did in that chapter is I wanted to show how we got to where we got in the U.S. post October 7th. The BDS movement starts in the late 20th century at the University of California at Berkeley, and it starts with a group of Students for Justice in Palestine, which had already been founded, and they stand outside the gate, Spruill Gate, the main gate entry to campus, and they decide that they're going to divide people trying to come into campus between Israelis and Palestinians, and the Israelis can cross, and the Palestinians they're going to harass. And then enough of them, about 300 of them, end up occupying a building, and the university has to call them in and arrest them. Well, that event is like maybe 2001, maybe even earlier. And it's the same thing that happens when we get to 2023, 2024. So I was seeing the antecedents of the contemporary movement, and I was trying to show that. But what I was also trying to show was that, and this is not a debate about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, it's what happened to Jewish students already on college campuses. In 2002, 300 college and university presidents signed a letter published in the New York Times, which talked about that Jewish students on their campus were facing intimidation, even violence, this is during the Second Intifada, and that they were going to protect Jewish students and their classrooms would not be captured by any kind of non-civil discourse. Well, that's the same issue in 2002 that we're dealing with more than 20 years later. So I talk about those things because I wanted people to understand that what happened after October 7th, the tsunami of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that burst out, had deep origins from 2 decades before.
But do you think that we have any useful or satisfactory tools for making these kinds of distinctions between critique of Israeli policy or even critique of the fundamental structures of the Israeli regime, no matter how hard-hitting and uncomfortable for Israeli and American Jewish audiences to hear, and anti-Semitism that is motivated by hatred of Jews in the classic sense?
Right. So you want to make a distinction, and I do think there is a viable distinction. I think the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are protesting in the streets against the current administration well before October 7th is an indication of that. I think the hundreds of thousands of Americans who have been protesting against the Trump administration is also a legitimate expression of animosity towards a regime that's doing something that they find is actually destroying the Democratic Republic, small d, small r, of the United States. But when it crosses over into behavior that threatens Jews, and if you've read, I think we talked about this, I have read the Stanford report of its task force on anti-Semitism. I've read 3 of Columbia University's proposed 4 reports of its task force on anti-Semitism. When you read the examples, you hit a point where it doesn't really matter that the person who moved out of the dorm room because they don't want to live with a Zionist had never really discussed politics with that roommate. Instead, they had simply assumed that they were a Zionist because they were a Jew. So I appreciate the effort to make the distinction, but I wonder if we're past the point where it really matters.
Okay, again, I want to come back to American politics, but while we're talking about Israel, I'm wondering how you think the book will be received or should be received by an Israeli audience. For your average Israeli on the street who has not spent tons of time in the United States and is perplexed today watching television and seeing pictures of campus protests, what does your book say to that average Israeli on the street, if there is such a thing?
The first thing I should say is I hope they read something else beside my book, because this is not a new history of America's Jews. It is a counterpoint, a contribution to the really wonderful histories of the American Jewish people, like Jonathan Sarna's American Judaism, these great narratives, or like Deborah Dash Moore's wonderful history of New York Jews. And if you only read this, then you get a completely warped picture of the American Jewish experience. Obviously, I did not write this book for an Israeli audience. I think Israelis would need a lot more context to understand what's going on in the book. I'm hoping, obviously, that the book will get translated so that it will become more available. But I do, and why don't we go back to the title for a second, because I do see this as a tradition that courses through American life. we have multiple traditions in the United States. It's quite evident at the moment. We have a liberal tradition, and we also have an authoritarian tradition that, are essentially at war with each other at this moment in the United States. And anti-Semitism is one of the racist traditions that exists in America. I should also point out, for all of you who are like grammar nerds like me, that the title anti-Semitism, it's a comma and then an American tradition. I see Hannah smiling. And it's because if my agent said to me, it should be a colon. And I said, no, a colon makes a subtitle, and subtitles to books get completely lost. So, and my editor never pushed back on that. And it's pretty rare, I think, to have a comma in a book title.
Well, then, could you say a bit more about the meaning of tradition and the importance for you of having an American tradition as part of the actual title and not a subtitle? Why did you feel the need to stress the extent to which anti-Semitism constitutes a tradition as opposed to just sporadic, unrelated episodes here and there?
First of all, there were too many to be sporadic and unrelated. Secondly, this is where I'm resting on the scholarship. In 2010, a wonderful historian named Tony Michaels published an article about anti-Semitism in America, where he argued that it was and wasn't different from Europe, because he said it really depended on what country in Europe you looked at. If you were looking at Denmark, anti-Semitism in America was actually worse than it was in Denmark. And at the end of the article, he talked about a political theorist who wrote about these competing traditions that are part of American life. And so it's not just Democrats versus Republicans, but that these arguments, and for example, we have the same argument about immigration. Right now, there's a tremendous opposition on the part of the administration to immigrants in American life, but there were eras in American society when there was welcoming of immigrants. And it made me, when I read that article over again and over again and over again, it convinced me that anti-Semitism was one of these traditions.
And is anti-Semitism a distinctive tradition, or is it sort of a sub-branch of, say, the nativist tradition, the anti-immigrant tradition?
I think it's distinctive. I think it's distinctive because the nativist tradition and the other traditions don't rest on essentially 2 millennia of anti-Judaism. And it's impossible to understand anti-Semitism in America unless you understand the power of anti-Judaism.
Mm-hmm. So you think that actually the Christian roots of America are decisive for the forms that anti-Semitism takes?
Exactly.
So let's jump ahead to the present. And you just talked about the scholarship on which you rely, but now I want to talk about your public scholarship and your public-facing work. And in particular, your testimony in Congress. As I mentioned, Pamela has testified in Congress on multiple occasions, but perhaps the most famous hearing in which she participated was the December 2023 hearing, which featured the presidents of MIT, Penn, and Harvard, and did not go so well for those university presidents. So could you tell us a little bit maybe about your experience in that specific hearing, but more generally, what did you hope to achieve by testifying in Congress? How do you understand the public role of history and historians? How do you think that your research can hopefully inform and elevate public debate?
I think I probably got invited because they thought I knew something about anti-Semitism, and they thought that maybe Congress would be interested in hearing something about the history of anti-Semitism in the U.S. The hearing went on for 5 hours. This is the hearing in December 2023. About 90 seconds went viral out of a 5-hour hearing. I spoke for about 15 minutes in those 5 hours. I was there because the Democrats who invited me, the presidents were invited by the Republicans, and the Democrats who invited me assumed that it would be nice to have something on the record about American anti-Semitism. Frankly, I had actually testified in Congress the month before in House Judiciary. This time I was in House Workforce and Education. And I had also testified in Congress back in 2017. How did I find myself in Congress? I'm local. I'm like a subway away, metro ride away. And back in 2017, when they were looking for a professor to talk about the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, all my colleagues who were invited before me said they didn't want to do it. And I thought, well, it'd be kind of interesting, And one of the things that I learned, and I want to say something else about that hearing, these hearings are public performances. They're not legal events, and it was heartbreaking, frankly, to watch all three presidents who had been prepared by the same law firm. I was prepared by some other people. I didn't even know you were supposed to get prepared. A friend actually said her husband had been a counsel on Senate Judiciary. He was going to prep me. So, and it was heartbreaking because they didn't want to give answers. They should have just simply said, if genocide, calls for genocide of a people is not against our conduct code, we need to amend our conduct code. I mean, it would have been such an easy answer, but it was the end of a very long day. And I also want to make a comment about the misogyny in that room. Other times when I've walked into those hearings, it's been more balanced at the witness table, but it was 4 women staring out at what is essentially a sea of mostly men, more women on the Democratic side, fewer on the Republican side. And it was, and none of the women had been in office more than the longest one was a year and a half. One of them had been in office only for a couple of months. So Claudine Gay and Liz McGill lose their jobs over it at Harvard and at the University of Pennsylvania. Sally Kornbluth, who is Jewish and who's deeply enmeshed in the Jewish community, both at her former position at the University of North Carolina and in her position now at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, did not lose her position. And so far, nobody's called to fire me.
And did you learn anything from these experiences about how historians and academics can more effectively intervene in the public sphere?
When you're talking in Congress, you're not intervening in the public sphere at all. I mean, I have heard people watched all 5 hours. I've heard lots of people. Oh, you did? You watched it? No. Yeah, people watched all 5 hours. I heard about people who have read my congressional testimony, because one of the things is you have to write this testimony, but then you have to summarize it in 5 minutes. Sometimes people write 60, 70 pages. I wrote about 12, but that's a 5-minute summary of that is not very much. And the way that I see my public scholarship is more in terms of what I write that is sent out, in mainstream media. Or frankly, this book is not published by an academic press. It was published by W. Norton, the mainstream American press, who also published my last one. That I want to reach people with my scholarship, as I know Ruth does with hers. I want to reach widely.
So I want to, in conclusion, talk a little bit about the very complicated political moment in which we find ourselves in the United States, and not just in the United States. And you mentioned the multiple traditions that are constitutive of the American political tradition. Some of them are liberal, some of them are nativist, some of them are racist. And from the very beginning, these different competing strands have been locked in a struggle for hegemony and for defining the American political culture. And I think we're at a similar moment right now where, unfortunately, the nativist strands are ascendant and the liberal strands are in crisis. And many of the political strategies that the Jewish community developed to fight anti-Semitism successfully, when those fights were successful, drew on the liberal toolkit. And I'm wondering if you think that these strategies are relevant today, given the new crises that we're facing, the liberal strategies that the Jewish organizations, again, for a period, used with such skill and success. Do they have any purchase today?
I hope so, but I'm not convinced. What's happening in the United States at the moment is that the legacy organizations, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, are taking the lead on combating anti-Semitism, What's also happened, and this is a reflection of the disorganization of the American Jewish community, is that there are so many organizations that have cropped up to start fighting anti-Semitism. By the way, also using academia to do that. University of Michigan raised $35 million to create a brand new center for the study of anti-Semitism and racism. There's a new center at New York University. They're just cropping up all over the place. And it's completely disorganized. The academicians are trying to get together so that we can at least talk to one another. But the other organizations are just, I think, throwing millions of dollars frankly, at the wall, thinking they're going to be able to solve the problem and determined that they have to solve it immediately. And that's not the solution. This is not going to be solved overnight. The discriminations that I talked about earlier in the 20s and the 30s persist into the 60s and 70s, and it would behoove the American Jewish community to do some kind of coordinated effort so that they sort of divide up spheres of influence and also have a broader strategy that will harness the liberal agenda and also how to respond to the very terrible reality that anti-Semitism is being weaponized to, give one example, destroy American higher education, research in medicine and science. And if that happens, if American preeminence in higher education research and medical research and scientific research, if the U.S. universities lose their position of preeminence in the world, eventually people are going to remember it happened because of the Jews. It's just going to exacerbate anti-Semitism.
So, I mean, again, I think this is precisely the very difficult dilemma that confronts us today, is how to combat anti-Semitism and its weaponization simultaneously. And I think I agree that the mainstream legacy organizations have not done a good job at all. And arguably, some of them, like the ADL, are actually complicit or in various ways have abetted Trump's campaign against the universities, seemingly oblivious to the possibility that you just mentioned, right? That once these institutions are destroyed in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, people who will be blamed, the Jews will be blamed. So I think, if we want to try to think beyond these legacy organizations that either just don't understand the moment we're in or lack the tools to confront the moment that we're in, what can we do either as citizens or maybe we should think of our distinctive role as academics and scholars, since one of the institutions that's being attacked is academia. And as you yourself point out, the attack on academia is not just an attack on universities, but it's an attack on social welfare at large, because basic science research is being crippled in the name of fighting anti-Semitism today. So how can we as scholars, as academics, navigate this moment? And what is our responsibility? Are there forms of social and political capital that we wield as scholars and academics that we can use to try to combat the manipulation of anti-Semitism while also combating actual anti-Semitism?
I don't know. What do you think?
I guess I want to believe that it's possible, but does the history that you relate in this book give us any insight, in terms of?
I think scholars, we don't exactly live in an ivory tower, but we also don't interact very often with so many other places in the world. What we do in a very small way is we teach, we reach our students, and we send them out into the world, hopefully with tools that will improve the situation. I'll give you an example from my class from the fall. I had a conversation with a student. I believe he's an immigrant, probably from somewhere in Asia, and he had taken my course on anti-Semitism, the history of anti-Semitism, and he went home over his Thanksgiving break and talked to a friend who started spouting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And he tried to disabuse his old high school friend of those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That's what I was able to do he wasn't able to convince his friend. So we start small. We start with these personal relationships. Obviously, the key, but not at the moment, the key is building a vertical alliance from the ground up, all the way up to the federal government, to restore liberal society, and so that we do what we can in terms of the political alliances. And then the other key are these, what I see as horizontal efforts, starting with my student and running all the way to interethnic and interfaith coalitions. But it's a very tough moment because a lot of those coalitions that had worked in the past don't work anymore.
Okay, so on that note, with the reminder that the fight against anti-Semitism is part of larger political struggles, a larger struggle against racism, hatred, and discrimination, and a larger struggle to defend democracy and its foundational institutions, I want to hear from the audience because I'm sure that there are many questions. So on that somewhat somber note, I want to thank Pamela for the book and for the conversation. And I think you
And I want to thank you. Thank you.
Thank all of you. And I hope this conversation has vindicated the contribution that historical research can make to navigating our contemporary controversies.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you.
Great.